Rathlin Island. Imagine a beautiful island surrounded on all sides by clear, sapphire water, matched only with the same sapphire skies. Plants and wildlife abound, living freely amongst the tiny population of only 125 souls. It is a relaxed atmosphere, and those few who live here love it. It is the northernmost point of Northern Ireland, known as Rathlin Island. Off the coast of County Antrim, this island has a long, sordid history that does not match its dazzling landscape. The darkness seems out of place here. Yet, it is because of this land's beauty that the darkness exists. The island has always drawn people to it, whether good or bad. Some of them remain with the land to this day. It began with the first Viking raid on Ireland in the 8th century. The raid marked the destruction of the island's church and the burning of its buildings. Hundreds, if not thousands, of lives were lost. In 1306, Robert the Bruce, King of the Scots, sought refuge upon the island in Rathlin Castle, now known as Bruce's Castle. Owned then by the Bissett family, Bruce and his men were welcomed into their home after being defeated by Edward I's army. The Bissets would later regret their decision when they were stripped of their land and possessions by the English, retribution for their friendship with Bruce. People say that Bruce and his men are still on the island. Locked there by a spell, they sleep in a cave on the site where the castle once stood. When they finally awake, they will rise up and reunite Rathlin to Scotland. The island has also been the site of a number of massacres. In 1557, Sir Henry Sidney raided the island, destroying anything and everything. Only a few decades later, in 1575, hundreds of men, women, and children from Clan MacDonald were slaughtered when Francis Drake and John Norreys were sent to Rathlin to confront Scottish refugees. You can still hear the cries of the children as they were ripped from their mothers' arms. In 1642, soldiers of the Argyll's foot were ordered to kill the Catholic MacDonalds, relatives of Clan MacDonald, their arch-clan enemy in the Scottish Highlands. The soldiers acted swiftly and efficiently, throwing hundreds of MacDonald women over cliffs to their deaths on rocks below. The number of deaths from this massacre is still unknown. Some say it as many as 3,000. In 1917, HMS Drake was torpedoed and sank just off the island. 18 lives were lost. There are countless more deaths linked to Rathlin Island, too many for this book. Its history is so dark and prolific that it has been featured on the US television program Destination Truth, a paranormal investigation show. You can find it in the March 17, 2011, airing, where they discuss the banshee cries heard on Rathlin Island day and night. With so much death and destruction, it is not hard to imagine the numerous ghosts living on the island today. Here are some of the many stories Rathlin Island has to share. Some are frightening, others are simply curious. They all belong to people who know the island best. Those who have lived and worked here their whole lives, and will probably die here too. Hopefully, their ghosts won't join the ones they encountered. The Watcher of the Lighthouse. The Rathlin West Light, standing on the cliffs of the island, has long been a beacon for sailors navigating the treacherous waters. Built in the early 20th century, it has seen countless storms and saved many lives. But not all those who have come to the lighthouse have left. In the early 1920s, a lighthouse keeper named James McAllister worked there. He was known for his dedication, rarely leaving his post and always ensuring the light was in perfect working order. One stormy night, James went missing. His boat was found smashed against the rocks, but his body was never recovered. The locals say that James never truly left. It was a calm night when I decided to visit the lighthouse, hoping to capture some of its beauty with my camera. As I walked up the winding path, I felt a chill in the air despite it being a warm summer evening. I brushed it off and continued my ascent. Upon reaching the top, I set up my camera and began taking photos. As I looked through the lens, I saw a shadowy figure standing by the light, staring out at the sea. Startled, I lowered the camera, but there was no one there. Thinking it was a trick of the light, I continued taking pictures. The figure appeared again, this time closer to the edge, as if looking for something. I decided to call out, "Hello. Is anyone there?" No response came, just the sound of the wind and the distant waves crashing against the rocks. I packed up my camera and started to leave when I heard a faint voice behind me. "The light must never go out." I turned quickly, but again, there was no one there. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence beside me. A shiver ran down my spine. I hurried back down the path, and as I glanced back, I saw the figure standing by the light once more, watching me leave. To this day, I believe that James McAllister still tends to the lighthouse, ensuring the light never fades. Rathlin's Haunted Inn. Rathlin Island's only inn has been a staple for travellers for centuries. Built in the 1700s, it has hosted many guests, including fishermen, adventurers, and even fugitives. However, not all who stayed at the inn left it in peace. In the mid-1800s, a notorious smuggler named Thomas O'Connell was cornered by British soldiers. Desperate, he sought refuge at the inn, hiding in a secret cellar. The soldiers found him, and a bloody battle ensued. Thomas was killed, and the inn cellar was sealed, never to be opened again. But Thomas's spirit never rested. I was spending the night at the inn, intrigued by its history and charm. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Donnelly, shared stories of the inn's past over a cup of tea by the fire. As the night grew late, I decided to retire to my room. Around midnight, I was awoken by a loud thumping noise coming from below. Groggy and curious, I followed the sound down to the main floor. The noise seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. I remembered Mrs. Donnelly mentioning the old cellar, so I went to find her. She was already awake, standing in the hallway with a lantern. "You heard it too," she said, her face pale. "That's Thomas. He's restless tonight." We made our way to the old cellar door, long sealed and forgotten. The thumping grew louder. Mrs. Donnelly hesitated before unlocking the door. "He doesn't mean harm, but he wants to be found," she whispered. The door creaked open, and we descended the narrow staircase into the dark, musty cellar. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth. In the faint light of the lantern, we saw a figure standing in the corner, its outline barely visible. "Thomas!" Mrs. Donnelly called softly. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. The lantern flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw his face gaunt, with hollow eyes filled with sorrow. He reached out towards us, and I could feel his anguish. Suddenly, the lantern went out, and we were plunged into darkness. The thumping stopped, and the air grew still. Mrs. Donnelly relit the lantern, but the figure was gone. "He just wanted to be remembered," she said, her voice trembling. We hurried back upstairs, leaving the cellar door open. The next morning, the thumping had ceased, and the inn felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Thomas's spirit, it seemed, had finally found peace. The fisherman's ghostly friend. I'm a fisherman, as my father before me. We all know the stories of Rathlin. I never put much stock in them, until one day when it happened to me. I was out on the water all morning. I'd started early with my team, around 4 a.m. There were 5 of us, and we'd all been at our jobs for over 20 years. The fish were biting well until more boats got out there, then they all got scared off. We decided to take a break before going off into deeper waters, away from the leisure boats. There's a little cave that sits off the shore of Rathlin. It's not very big or very deep, but it's enough to keep the sun off your back when you've been out all day and want to rest. My men and I pulled up just outside the cave and got out, securing our boat before heading inside with our food. I'd say the cave is maybe 30 feet deep and 10 feet wide. It was dark, but it was mid-afternoon, so there was still light coming in through the entrance. "Hey guys, come here. Look at this," Mark called. He'd gone to the back of the cave since it was darker and cooler back there, and he wanted to lay down for a bit. We went to where he was calling from and were shocked to see that at the back of the cave was a small opening that we'd never noticed before, despite having been inside this cave 100 times. We took turns peering in and realized that it led to another part of the cave we never knew existed. We squeezed through and came out the other side into an empty space that was sort of a circle shape. It was dark back here and the air was actually cold. We turned on our flashlights and walked around, intrigued by this space we'd never seen before. Finally, we got tired of exploring it and sat down. "I'm making tea," Mark said. "Who wants some?" We all said we did as Mark started a small fire there in the center of the cave. The air was very musty back here, but there was something very soothing about it as well. It almost felt like it was caressing my skin. After a minute, Mark set his tea kettle over the fire, holding it over the flames on a long stick until the water was hot. We gathered round him, holding out our mugs as he poured some for each of us. Mark was just about to pour some into my mug when his eyes suddenly went wide. He stopped mid-pour and looked up at me. He was terrified. Slowly, his eyes circled our group. Mine followed his. I didn't see anything. There was nothing to frighten him, unless he was scared of the dark. I looked back down at my mug, eager for my hot cup of tea, when suddenly I saw what had frightened Mark so much. There were 5 of us in the cave. Yet there were 6 sets of hands. To my left, there was an extra mug, coming from out of the darkness. I was afraid to look too closely at it, terrified of what I might find. Now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. And now, I could feel it too. There was someone breathing beside me. Someone who didn't belong there. "Finish filling our cups, Mark," I said. His hands shook, but he carried on, filling the extra cup. It withdrew back into the darkness. I finally found the courage to look where the hand had pulled back, and there was nothing there. We all saw it, but none of us can explain it to this day. Ghostly sounds at the castle ruins. Robert the Bruce was a hero in my house growing up. My father always said we were related to him, though I was never sure if that was true or just wishful thinking. One day, he took me for a drive down to where Rathlin Castle used to stand. "This is where Bruce lived." "He didn't exactly live here, Dad," I replied, being a snot-nosed teenager. My father glared at me but said nothing. "Come on," he said, getting out of the car and dragging me with him. I groaned but got out of the car. It's a beautiful place. Right on the water, Bruce's castle must have been amazing to see when it was still here. Now, nothing but a few stones remain to mark its location. My father took his time walking around the crumbling ruins. It was almost as though he were breathing in the past. I envied him a little. He was clearly passionate about Robert the Bruce. "So tell me," I said, deciding to make him happy and act interested. "What happened here? Did Bruce die here?" "No," my father said. "Bruce died years later. No one's really sure how he died. This is where he led his men after Edward I's army defeated them." It was at that exact moment when the sound of horses came ringing through the air. My father and I both turned at the same time. The air was warm. The land around us seemed undisturbed. What was that?" I asked. "Horses," my father said. "Yeah, but where are they?" He didn't answer me. His eyes searched the horizon around us. It was the afternoon and quite bright out. Suddenly, we heard the horses neigh again, and hoof steps seemed to be growing closer. Still, there was nothing around us except empty land. "Dad?" I asked, stepping towards him. I didn't care if I was 15, I was freaking out. Their hoof steps grew closer and louder, thundering on the ground like there were hundreds of them no more than 10 feet from us. Then a deep, strong voice suddenly called out, "We've come seeking refuge. Edward is on our trail." Then the voice disappeared, and the horses went with it. My father and I stood staring at one another, not knowing what to say. Finally, he indicated that we should get back in the car. We've never talked about what happened, and he never tried to get me to go out to Bruce's castle again.